Hey, Stan Deaton with the Georgia Historical Society. Welcome back. It's December in Savannah, and this is the time of year every year that we remember the arrival of one of Savannah's most notorious guests. I'm talking about United States General William Tecumseh Sherman, who arrived here in Savannah in December 1864 at the end of his infamous March to the Sea. It all happened 158 years ago after Sherman had taken Atlanta in September, and in November, he marched his army of 60,000 men out of the city of Atlanta and marched 300 miles across Georgia before he arrived here in Savannah on December 21st, 1864. General Sherman's campaign began back in May 1864 when he marched his army of 110,000 men out of Chattanooga with the objective being Atlanta. Between Sherman and Atlanta stood General Joseph Johnston and his Confederate army. Now, Johnston notoriously was not an aggressive general, and Confederate President Jefferson Davis was afraid Johnston would surrender Atlanta without a fight. Well, there was plenty of fighting between Chattanooga and Atlanta. It took 4 months for Sherman to eventually capture the important city of Atlanta on September 2nd, really ensuring President Lincoln's re-election. Sherman had to wait until after Election Day on November 8th before he could set out on the next phase of his campaign. He wanted to cut himself off from his supply line and march to the sea, the objective being either Charleston in South Carolina or Savannah. He had to get permission from Commanding General Ulysses S. Grant, which he finally got. And so on November 15th, General Sherman and his army of 60,000 men at that point, he split it into two wings. One wing went east toward Augusta, the other went south toward Macon. They eventually met in Milledgeville, and the capital city of Georgia surrendered on November 23rd. General Sherman pushed on and arrived here in Savannah on December 21st. When he got here, the United States Army set up command headquarters in the building behind me, which is now the headquarters of the Oglethorpe Club. General Sherman, while he was here in Savannah, used this home behind me as his headquarters. It's now the Green Meldrum House. It was owned by Charles Green in 1864, and Sherman lived here from December 22nd, 1864 to February 1st, 1865. Now, many of the visitors who come to Savannah now remark on the beauty of the city and much of the architecture that predates the Civil War, and they wonder why Sherman didn't destroy Savannah. The truth is, Sherman did not destroy any city that would willingly return to the allegiance of the United States, which Savannah did when its mayor, Richard Arnold, marched out on December 21st and surrendered Savannah and returned its allegiance to that of the United States. Now, Sherman notoriously, after he got here, sent a telegram to President Lincoln in which he offered the city of Savannah along with 25,000 bales of cotton as a Christmas present to President Lincoln. Before the United States Army arrived in Savannah, there was a notorious incident north of here at Ebenezer Creek, which brought a lot of unwanted press attention to Sherman and his army. As the left wing, the 14th Corps, under the command of U.S. General Jefferson C. Davis, was crossing Ebenezer Creek, they laid down pontoon bridges for the army to cross. The 14th Corps was being followed by hundreds of fugitive enslaved people who had escaped from nearby plantations who were following Sherman's army as an army of liberation. General Davis was trying to get his corps into Savannah, and as soon as the army crossed Ebenezer Creek, which was flooded and swollen from rain, he pulled the pontoon bridges up, and many of the African Americans who were following felt the Confederate army was bearing down on them, and many of them jumped into the river to swim across and follow the army, and many of them drowned and died. The numbers are in dispute. It's as high as several hundred, as low as 30. But when the army arrived here in Savannah, the northern press had gotten wind of what had happened at Ebenezer Creek, and Sherman and General Davis came under fire. The upshot of it was that in January, Secretary of War Edwin Stanton came down, and he and General Sherman here in the greenhouse met with 20 African-American leaders from Savannah's religious community, and out of that came one of the most important field orders in United States history. It was Field Order 15, which confiscated land owned by former Confederates from Charleston south to the St. Johns River for 30 miles inland, and it was going to be redistributed to African-American families. It was out of this that came the famous 40 acres and a mule. Now, Field Order 15 was one of the most important moments in the history of emancipation was later rescinded by President Andrew Johnson, but it happened because of the incident at Ebenezer Creek and the meeting which happened here at the greenhouse in 1865. Sherman's march now, 158 years later, has been encrusted with layer after layer after layer of myth. He is seen, of course, as one of the first great war criminals in some camps, that his campaign was one of scorched earth. It was the first time that the hard hand of war had been brought to a population indiscriminately, and that everything in his path was destroyed. Historians over the last generation have spent a great deal of effort peeling back the layers of that myth, and they now know that that simply wasn't true. Sherman gave very strict orders that, of course, this was psychological warfare. They were going to destroy anything in their path that could be used to wage war. We're talking about railroads, train depots, factories, cotton gins, warehouses, and of course the private livestock and crops and barns of people along the way. He wanted to prove to the people of Georgia that the government of the Confederacy in Richmond could not protect its citizens from the United States Army, that those armies could march wherever they pleased. Sherman was living proof of that. He was also making the point that he was not here to make enemies of anyone when the Confederate citizens returned to the loyalty of the United States. The fact that he didn't destroy Savannah is proof of that. He said, I am not here for your slaves, your property, or anything else, but what we are here for and what we will eventually get is allegiance to the United States. That was his overall encompassing goal. Now, when Sherman and his army got into South Carolina, it was a different story. They viewed South Carolina as the origin of the war, the reason that they were here in the first place, the reason that they had to come down here and endure 4 years of war and destruction. They thought South Carolina had started the war when it seceded after Abraham Lincoln's election in 1860. So the hard hand of war was visited on the people, Columbia and Charleston, and much of South Carolina. What we also know is that General Sherman did not indiscriminately destroy the homes of private citizens along the route, contrary to myth. Research was done in the 1950s and published in September 1957 in the Georgia Historical Quarterly that many of the antebellum homes along the route were still standing in the 1950s. Those that weren't had been destroyed, many of them, after the war. Of course, there were some individual homes that had been destroyed. When 60,000 men are marching across the landscape, bad things are going to happen, and some certainly did during this march. So General Sherman has come down to us as the first purveyor of modern war, and he brought psychological warfare to the people of Georgia, and he has never been forgotten. We remember him every year here in Savannah. We also need to remember that his was an army of liberation that helped end the institution of slavery, it helped end the Civil War, and reunify the United States. Stay safe, stay strong. I'm Stan Deaton with the Georgia Historical Society. As always, thank you for watching.